Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about the situation developing in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan's presidential election, the results are out. Incumbent President Ashraf Ghani, he's won the presidential elections by just over 50% of the votes. His biggest rival in the presidential race, Mr. Abdullah, the chief executive of the unity government, he's rejected the result and he said that he will run his own inclusive government, he says. Now, this comes at a pretty critical time for Afghanistan. The US is closing in on a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban, which should pave the way for intra-Afghan talks with the government in Kabul. Afghanistan's Interior Minister Masood Andrabi said the US-Taliban violence reduction deal, as he quotes it, will take effect within the next 4 to 5 days. Now, the Taliban, on the other hand, have also rejected Ashraf Ghani's win. A Taliban spokesperson yesterday issued this statement, excerpts from which I'll just read out here. As the Islamic Emirate has rejected the fake and staged elections drama under the shadow of the occupation in its entirety, it similarly rejects this meaningless appointment and considers it a failed effort at throwing dust in the eyes of the nation. End quote. Now, the statement further said, just as announcing Ashraf Ghani a president under the cover of fake elections is unlawful and has no legal basis, it is also in conflict with the contents of the ongoing peace process while keeping in mind the current sensitive circumstances of the Afghan issue. End quote. We will be discussing this and more with our guests, what the options are to the newly formed government. Will it last? What is the standing of Ashraf Ghani now, considering such a low voter turnout, and especially how this affects the US-Taliban deal? Let me begin by introducing the guests who are joining us, our panel of experts, starting from Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard. He's joining us from Kabul. He's an analyst and the Director of Public Relations Coordination, Administrative Office of the President, Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Now, we also have with us Ms. Tanya Goudsouzian, an analyst and the head of interviews at TRT World. She's joining us today from Istanbul. And Mr. Najib Sharifi, a journalist and a member of Afghanistan Analysis and Awareness, a Kabul-based think tank, today joining us from Kabul. Mr. Sharifi, let's begin with you. This US-Taliban deal, 4 to 5 days away. There's an understanding that they have come to some type of agreement when it comes to declaring a ceasefire, so to lead on to eventually a US withdrawal. Is this deal in jeopardy right now in the current circumstances?
Well, it would be very difficult to say it's a jeopardy, but the political turmoil in Kabul will definitely complicate peace negotiations or the peace agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban. At the same time, we also need to keep in mind that more than anything else at this stage in Afghanistan, we need political unity. So any kind of grand political disagreements or political turmoil will be definitely a major setback for Afghanistan.
A major setback for Afghanistan. Mr. Hamdard, not only the Taliban are rejecting this win, but also Abdullah talking about his own parallel government that he wants to start. He's got the endorsement of Dostum, no surprise there. How is this going to affect the new Kabul administration?
I believe that Dr. Abdullah has got the habit of rejecting since 2009 presidential elections. Then in 2014, he continued the same drama. And in 2004, however, he succeeded to share the government with Dr. Ghani. And he broke into the government as chief executive officer. But I guess this is 2020 and people are not accepting him anymore, because he agreed to the rules of elections, which is a democratic process in which people participated and cast their votes, both to Dr. Abdullah, Dr. Ghani, and other candidates. Here now he has a responsibility, a democratic responsibility and a legal responsibility to accept the defeat. And as in other countries, those who are beaten in elections, they respectfully congratulate the winner, and the winner should also thank the other participants in the elections, I mean the candidates in the elections, that they made this process legal, because it was their participation that elections took place and will cast their votes, and finally a president is chosen or elected. If Dr. Abdullah is doing, if he announces himself as president, I guess this is something that I really feel sorry for him, because the legal authority or administration is the Independent Electoral Commission of Afghanistan. That is the only authorized commission who can announce the president based on the 50% plus one vote as a result of the elections.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Sharifi, when Abdullah talks about a parallel government, we've seen the scenario unfolding in Libya. We've seen it in recent history, how that has led to one of the biggest conflicts in the region. This parallel government he talks about, what is the reality of it on ground? Can that even be be brought in Afghanistan?
Well, this is a major question, because speaking of a parallel government, nobody has explained of the details or the dynamics of a parallel government. Nobody has spelled out what a parallel government would actually mean in real terms. However, we've got to keep in mind that in the current political landscape of Afghanistan, where we have major political instability, provinces could easily stop obeying the central government if this scenario of formation of a parallel government comes into play. However, we have got to keep in mind that in the past, we have had allegations of formation of a parallel government or an alternative government. But at the end of the day, the political leaders have shown necessary maturity to not basically go to that far extent. Because at the end of the day, any kind of turmoil, grand turmoil in Afghanistan will basically, will be harmful to everybody in the country, to all players, regardless of it being Dr. Abdullah or Dr. Ghani or any other political player.
Ms. Tanya, we're talking about a turnout which has been lowest in Afghan history polling. Out of a population of 35 million, there were 1.8 million votes. What does that say to you essentially about Ashraf Ghani's win now? Is it going to be the true representation of the people, especially when contenders and the Taliban are outright protesting this, rejecting this win?
Well, I think I need to reiterate what I said earlier, that these people, those who did go out to the boxes, did so much in security conditions. The Taliban had issued a statement warning that if they dared to take exercise, that they would be considered targets. So those people did very much at their own risk to now question the results of this election. Frankly, emotions are running high. Very much, there have been allegations left, right, and center. But we have to consider the next step. Will these threats of parallel governments, this division within the country, strengthen the Taliban's hand in the upcoming intra-Afghan talks? This is something to consider.
So if this is something to consider here, Mr. Hamdard, could this also be a possibility that Ashraf Ghani would consider a more inclusive government where Abdullah and other contenders in the race will be given a kind of a seat on the table? Because right now they're at a point where intra-Afghan talks is the last thing that they can risk losing at this juncture.
Well, I believe Dr. Ghani is going to have an inclusive government, but not as the current government, which was the National Unity Government, in which Dr. Abdullah was sharing 50% of the power. Dr. Ashraf Ghani will not share the power with anyone. However, he will include some political elites who can serve the country in the better way. He will include them in his government, I believe this, and he has the intention for this, but not the ones who think that they are sharing the power with Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani will lead, the state builder team will lead this next government, and the people will be included only as ministers or ambassadors or even director generals and etc. But the power will not be shared, I guess.
Mr. Sharifi, it speaks also of the 2014 elections, the situation right now when Ghani and Abdullah were again main contenders and they They then also argued over the results. They were constantly trading accusations of fraud. And this problem was resolved only when the US stepped in. The then Secretary of State, John Kerry, brokered a power-sharing deal, a rather awkward one at best, which stayed dysfunctional throughout the tenure. Do you feel like that Washington might, again, at this point where so much is at stake for them, might have the kind of diplomatic appetite to step in again?
Well, that's something that everybody believes will finally happen, because the stakes are extremely high for the U.S. The U.S. cannot tolerate any political mess in Kabul at this stage, because the U.S. has been investing months and years on forging peace negotiations with the Taliban, and it's about to come true. So we believe that if this argument is not resolved by intra-Afghan talks or with the Afghan political leaders, we'll definitely see the intervention of the U.S. and other, NATO countries, so that it's resolved peace without it taking Afghanistan to a political turmoil.
Right. But Ms. Tanya Goudsouzian, coming to this, the U.S., as President Trump has again reiterated in the past weeks, that is eager to bring his troops back home from Afghanistan. There is a fear that the mistake in Syria will be repeated here in Afghanistan. And now that they're so close to somewhat of a deal, is there, in your opinion, any steps ahead where their stay in Afghanistan might be prolonged in order to regain this political stability?
Well, I think President Trump has made it clear he does want to bring the troops home, but I don't think there was ever talk of completely abandoning Afghanistan. I mean, there were statements saying that, a peace deal will be signed, but let's be honest, it's a deal that both of them will sign but may not necessarily honor. There is no guarantee that the Taliban can and will rein in the various terror groups operating in the country today. The 7-day reduction in violence will be an indicator of that, perhaps. But and also there is no guarantee that the Americans will not come back in if the Taliban does not fulfill its end of the bargain. So that much is up for debate.
Right, and Mr. Hamdard, the Taliban in this deal this time round, as we have information that it's not really based on a timeline. It's more based on sort of milestone events, in the sense that the Taliban and the US will meet those objectives and hence the deal will go forward. But the concern really is that this will, of course, the ceasefire will demand that the Taliban not use fear and terror as the tools that they have in the past to dominate and to control. So do you expect that the Taliban will behave after the deal in the sense that they will compromise?
I said Taliban are ready to go for the deal, and they are ready to go, to show flexibility during this deal. Even the reduction of violence, which is going to start in 5 days from now, Taliban will stick to the reduction of violence with the U.S., because they see their interest is in peace with the Afghan government and with the U.S. They cannot fight longer than this, and they want to stop this fight, and they want to take the government, of course, and to rule the country legally. So I believe that they will stick to the rules this time, and hopefully they will not make mistakes or repeat the mistakes that they had made previously, because that will damage or destroy them completely this time. And this time, if they are not reaching to an agreement with the U.S. and the Afghan government, I believe Taliban will be totally destroyed, and they will be vanished by both the Afghan government and the international community in Afghanistan.
Mr. Hamdullah, thank you so much for giving your voice to this conversation. Coming back to you, Mr. Sharifi, about the same point that the Taliban have stated, they've stated their objective always, that the reestablishment of the Islamic Emirate. This is something that most Afghans have rejected. Of course, there's a lot of fear about the kind of discrimination against women, human rights, etc. But with this ceasefire deal in the offing, what is your take on it? Will there be compromise for the long term, at least, from the Taliban?
Well, the Taliban don't have any other choice but to make compromises, because today's Afghanistan is a radically different Afghanistan compared to when the Taliban were ruling in 1990s. Today, we can see a radical transformation in every sector and every field of life in the country. So, and this is something that the Taliban understand very well, because time is no longer friendly for them to reinstate or reestablish the Islamic Emirate that they had in 1990s. However, how much compromises they will make and what sort of a coalition government we'll have if peace negotiations or intra-Afghan peace talks succeed, that's something to be seen. But what I can say confidently is that the Taliban have to make compromises.
They have to make compromises. There's not much choice there, you say. Ms. Tanya Goudsouzian, coming to you here, their objection to Ashraf Ghani, the words I read out earlier, very strong words there, puppet government, something that has been the reason why they have not had or agreed to intra-Afghan talks. And now that government has been re-elected officially, democratically. Do you think that the Taliban, despite these claims, will have no choice but to have those intra-Afghan talks that are necessary for this to move forward?
Well, certainly the Afghan government, supporters of the Afghan government and supporters of the republic that was established will argue that the re-election of Ashraf Ghani, in fact, gives the president a renewed mandate, renewed legitimacy to represent the Afghan people at the intra-Afghan talks. That the Taliban have labeled the government this or that is irrelevant, because the Taliban itself has been labeled this or that. At the end of the day, I think nobody disputes the fact that all parties have to come to the table and talk about the future of Afghanistan.
But the concern also here is, while these are being seen, I mean, is accepted with the investigations that the Election Commission did and democratic elections here, Mr. Sharifi, there is this kind of inconspicuous silence from the major players here. We've not heard anything in terms of a congratulatory note or a comment from the US, the UK, even Germany on this presidential win for Mr. Ghani.
Yes, that's a major question, because we expected the Afghanistan's international allies to basically endorse the results of the elections as they were announced yesterday. But that has not happened yet. What is the motive behind it? I'm not in a position to speculate on that. But that will definitely have an impact on basically the perception of the people over the formation of the new government and the legitimacy of the government to be formed.
Ms. Goudsouzian, what's your on this? The fact that the US has not even stepped in and said that Ashraf Ghani, like even signaled that the acceptance of Ashraf Ghani's government.
Well, it's a little early to say. I think we are going to get some reactions. In fact, the deputy of Zalmay Khalilzad did make a statement to the effect that the current situation didn't look good. I don't remember the exact words. But this was a democratic exercise that was endorsed by the international community. The election process was very much endorsed by the international community at the time.
Ms. Tanya Goudsouzian, thank you so much. Also, Mr. Najib Ashrafi, for giving your voice to this conversation. We've come to the part of the program where we have to take a break. We'll be back to talk more about the possible revival of Israeli-Palestinian conflict planning. Welcome back to Newsmire. We're talking about President Trump's proposal for the Palestine-Israel conflict, what President Trump calls the deal of the century. Now, it's been rejected by the Palestinians outright, being called dead in the water or even a non-starter. However, there was an interesting development which we will be expanding on today, which is essentially the reaction from former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, which led to a meeting with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas earlier this month in New York. Now, together, both of them in a press conference, they essentially opposed the US peace plan, and they instead proposed to revive the Olmert Plan to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, these two sides had negotiated this plan back in 2008, right before Ehud Olmert was forced to resign due to corruption charges. Now, this put the negotiations back then on hold. So essentially, we're looking to investigate what this plan entailed and what is the future then and the impact of this possible revival of talks between the two. Let's hear what our guests have to say. First joined by Mr. Jafar Ramini. He's an analyst. He's also an author and a political commentator. He's joining us today from Perth. Mr. Ramini, welcome to Newswire. Right off the bat, if we are to take a bird's eye view of the Olmert peace plan back from 2008, what would be the key differences between that and now the Trump's deal of the century?
Then Olmert called his plan the realignment plan, which would have given the Palestinian Authority 90% of the land mass of the West Bank, and Israel will keep the other 10%, which were the major settlements then. Then it changed into the unilateral disengagement plan, which metaphored into the Israelis giving to the PA 90% of the time, 70% of the land, and keeping 30%. With what then the American President Obama called the land swaps. I mean, all of this is chasing a mirage. Mr. Abbas is refusing to understand. They will never, ever entertain a Palestinian state that is viable, contiguous with East Jerusalem as its capital. Now, we are dealing now with the far right, i.e. Mr. Netanyahu and the settler. And Mr. Abbas, to my certain knowledge, and he repeated that at the United Nations Security Council, he said, our peace culture. This is not peace, Mr. Abbas. This is surrender, and that is what the Israelis want. Why are we, the Palestinian nation, 13 million of us, are never consulted? Because Mr. Abbas and his clique in Ramallah think that Palestine is their inheritance, and so does Mr. Haniyeh in Gaza. Palestine doesn't belong to any faction. Palestine belongs to the Palestinian people, and it's about time we are asked, what is it you want?
Mr. Ramini, this comes at a time where Mr. Abbas is also looking at, in a few weeks, the completion of his term and is widely being seen out of favor with most supporters. I mean, the impact really of this sort of endorsement he's given to Mr. Olmert, is this holding any significance at this time?
Look. Mr. Abbas says something in the open and does something behind closed doors. He has been saying about the security coordination with Israel as sacred. And then he said, because of the Trump plan, we are going to cease this coordination. He hasn't. I have news for you and for your viewers. There is a new committee now within the PLO called the Communication Committee or the Dialogue Committee, which they invite Israelis to Ramallah to talk to, and then they go invited by some Israelis to Tel Aviv to talk to. Why don't you talk to your brothers in Gaza and talk to us in the diaspora and ask our opinion? Palestine is not the inheritance of Mr. Abbas, nor is it going to be his legacy. The Palestinian people refuse to surrender. If Mr. Abbas, Fatah, the PA, the PLO, and Hamas want to surrender, we are not surrendering. We reject this plan totally.
And this is probably to then reflect in the very controversial, very problem-ridden elections that are about to begin. But at this press conference in New York, when Mr. Abbas said that he's ready to pick up negotiations from where he left them off in 2008, and now what you're talking about here, the new communication committee, it seems again it is maybe a political move more than anything else to sort of one last attempt to win favor.
Mr. Abbas is an elderly man. He is 83, coming to 84. and he has been in power for far too long without a mandate. I do not want to demonize the man. I'm a Palestinian. My main concern is my nation and my land. And it has been usurped by Israel piecemeally, and our people have been living under occupation for the last 72 years. Enough is enough. It's about time the PLO understand that when the Arab League put them as in charge of our destiny, we were not consulted. It's akin when Balfour gave Palestine to the Jews, we were not consulted. We do exist. We have a voice. There is 13 million of us. You cannot keep ignoring us. Mr. Abbas will do better to redeem his reputation at his dotage and go to his maker, knowing that he's done the right thing by his people. If he quits and dissolves the PA, revokes the security coordination, and allow the people in Palestine to deal with the Israelis. I'm not calling for a war here, but at least let's have a civil disobedience movement like we did many times before.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jafar Ramini, for giving us your opinion there. We're now joined by Mr. Emmanuel Navon, an analyst and a foreign policy expert who also teaches at Tel Aviv University. He's joining us from Jerusalem. Mr. Navon, welcome to Newswire. Now, this meeting that has taken place between Mr. Abbas, Mr. Ehud Olmert, the understanding is that this was requested by Mr. Olmert, and in order to find a kind of a alternative to the US peace plan, what President Trump calls the deal of the century, and to revive a plan from back in 2008. What was the incentive here for Mr. Olmert?
Well, we have to understand and remember that Ehud Olmert was prime minister, resigned from his job as prime minister 12 years ago, that he is a former convicted criminal who sat in jail for bribery and fraud, and that the peace plan which he negotiated 12 years ago with Abbas was never accepted by Mahmoud Abbas himself. Abbas himself, by the way, was last elected for a 4-year term in 2005, and therefore he himself has absolutely no legitimacy. So this was a meeting with a Palestinian leader who was last elected for 4 years in 2005. We're now in 2020, and on the Israeli side was a convicted criminal who resigned 12 years ago. And who offered a peace deal which was rejected by Abbas. So this was completely surrealistic.
Right, and then, and then Mr. Olmert, he wrote this editorial in the Jerusalem Post. And here, I just want to read out, he says that I do not currently hold any public office. I do not profess to represent any political group. I'm not in contact with Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party, etc., etc. I mean, this sort of verbose explanation that I don't have any political incentive to be pushing this plan, to be like a spanner in the works. What is your take on that? How do you interpret this?
Well, in fact, yesterday, Ehud Olmert asked for the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, to erase his criminal record, which would enable him potentially to run again for office. There are rumors, in fact, that Ehud Olmert is planning a political comeback. So. And that seems to be confirmed by the fact that he had the president, as I said, to erase his criminal record.
Right, and also here, the plan itself that Mr. Ehud Olmert gave in 2008, which was not accepted by Mr. Abbas then, and now we see Mr. Abbas sort of endorsing this, agreeing to having discussions on this. I mean, the plan doesn't seem very different in detail than from what the plan, what President Trump had proposed.
Well, the differences, there are also major differences, in fact, between the Olmert Plan and the one submitted by President Trump. And that has to do mostly with the issue of Jerusalem. The 2008 plan submitted by Ehud Olmert agreed to a partition of Jerusalem and to some kind of international sovereignty over the Temple Mount. The Trump deal, on the other hand, talks about maintaining Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount, under Israeli sovereignty, while there would be a Palestinian capital in the eastern and northern neighborhood of the city, and also in terms of the territorial swaps. The plan of President Trump talks about much larger swaps on both sides, both Israeli annexations in the West Bank, but also Palestinian annexation in the border with Egypt, in the Negev, in the desert of the Negev. And these are the two major differences, I would say, between the two plans.
Right, and Hamas has come out to criticize Mr. Abbas's move, saying that this is based on illusions and delusions. What is the incentive here for Mr. Abbas to be even endorsing this or being part of this?
Well, Abbas, as I said, not only rejected or did not accept, to be more precise, the 2008 plan submitted by Olmert, but he also rejected the peace plan offered by the Obama administration by Secretary of State John Kerry in 2014. Now, you have to understand that Abbas, on the one hand, rejects all those offers, and on the other hand, is trying to keep himself relevant by meeting with Olmert and trying to come back to the offer he rejected in 2008. The problem with Abbas is also that politically he cannot afford to sign anything with Israel because his regime is weak, he's not legitimate, as I explained. His term as president of the Palestinian Authority ended in 2009, and we're now in 2020. His regime is corrupt. It is extremely unpopular among the Palestinians, and therefore he has no mandate, no authority to sign anything with Israel.
Right. Mr. Emmanuel, Navon, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your opinion there. Here we have Mr. Moin, Naim, an analyst and a Palestinian expert. He's joining us from Istanbul. Mr. Naim, Mr. Abbas's move right now being criticized largely for sort of giving in to something, but just quoting roughly what Mr. Abbas had recently said on his position on the Olmert Plan now, after that press conference in New York City, was essentially that the Palestinians can't afford right now to lose the kind of support they need as an opposition to the U.S. peace plan.
Yeah, in fact, I was surprised that Mr. Abbas still believing in such leaders in the occupation governments. Olmert was one of the criminals who killed thousands of Palestinians within his presidential periods, and now he's trying to use the Palestinian issue to come back to the politics and his old position after being arrested due to being guilty of sexual harassment and other sins. So I don't believe that any Israeli politician can be a part of a solution, because they are the problem, not the solution. I mean, the occupation is the problem. Any Israeli.
No, Mr. Naim, I'm trying to understand if Mr. Abbas's move is, like he says, what the Palestinians cannot afford right now, which is any kind of support they're going to get to oppose the U.S. plan, or is it the situation with the Palestinian Authority that it has absolutely no cards to confront the U.S. peace plan?
And unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority has a very important what we call cards to be used and play. The first one is the Palestinian unity, which Mr. Abbas still resisting not to make it and to finish this issue. The Palestinian public itself could be a very important obstacle against the application of this plan, as they did tens of years before Bush the son. Other plans, many other occupational plans were tried to be applied on the Palestinian territories, but the Palestinian people themselves obstacled the application. But Mr. Abbas, unfortunately, instead of searching for the solution in his country, between his people, he's trying to search for the solution in the occupational forces. How come that a president don't go to meet with his people's representatives till now, since the announcement of the Trump's war plan? Mr. Abbas did not make one single meeting with Palestinian parties and organization leaders, but he made meetings with occupational forces leaders like Olmert and the others.
That's exactly the question I was hoping for you to answer here, that Mr. Naim, Mr. Abbas's move, while those attempts by the PA could be made in bridging the gaps that have existed for years now between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and the PA, why is that not being worked on? Instead, what we're seeing are new committees being made where Israelis are being called in to have conversations over, negotiations over a peace plan.
Unfortunately, I will be honest to say that Mr. Abbas is afraid of losing the presidential position, or his party is afraid of losing the control of the Palestinian issue. They want to be the only party or the only power who control the faith and the future of the Palestinian people. They don't want to make any collective decision after meetings. For example, we have now more than 12 parties in Palestine who are asking Mr. Abbas to have only a meeting, but he's rejecting still. By doing this, he's weakening the Palestinian people, weakening the Palestinian side during the negotiation, even with the Israeli occupation powers. That's the problem. I think one of the most important problems is the Mr. Abbas resistance to Palestinian unity and Palestinian problem solution. Internal problem solution.
Right. But Mr. Naim, Mr. Abbas hitting his mid-80s now, the elections coming up again, the Palestinian opposition very vocal, not on just the US peace plan, but especially now with Mr. Abbas's move to rally behind Mr. Olmert's 2008 plan. Is this going to be that victory that the Palestinians desperately need, seeing him out of the door once and for all?
Yeah, unfortunately, me and you can think of resigning before Mr. Abbas think of that. He's believing that he will stay for hundreds of years in his position. He's thinking of being elected again and again. That's the problem of Mr. Abbas. He's like all other Arab leaders who are believing that moving up of their chairs can be happen only when they die.
But whose backing does he have? Whose backing does he have that he continues to get voted back in?
Exactly. I will be honest. I'll tell you. I will be open and honest in this position. Mahmoud Abbas has the money and the authority power, which he used to force the Palestinian people to follow him. Nothing else. For example, he has no election since 12 years. He don't accept election. Even all other Palestinian parties accepted the election decision. He still didn't announce the election decision, and he said that I will do it when I find it suitable and acceptable. Mr. Abbas deals with the Palestinian issue and as if it's an personal properties that he can deal as he likes. And I believe that what happens now in Palestinian issue, one of the most important reasons for what's happening in Palestinian issue now is Mr. Abbas himself and his mentality, and he has some smaller groups of beneficiaries who are supporting him to do this.
Right. And as long as Mr. Abbas stays in power, this will be a continuing problem, not bringing the Palestinians together, instead collaborating with the Israelis. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Mr. Naim, thank you so much for giving us your opinion there. We'll see you next week. Till then, goodbye.